All right. Good evening, folks. So I want to I want to actually begin the class tonight in a way very different than I normally begin the class, but I hope I'll be able to explain why I'm doing this and why it makes sense. So this is actually kind of a repeat of the email that I sent out Monday morning. I know not everybody reads them or they don't read everything I say, so I'll take the liberty of kind of repeating the story that I told there. So in the class last week, um, I mentioned that I had the privilege of meeting Yehuda Amichai, who I consider beyond question the greatest of contemporary Israeli poets. Um, and the context was I was in rabbinical school taking a class in Hebrew poetry from the Torah through modern Israel. And the professor was an Israeli poet by the name of Tet Carmi, and he was a well-known, important poet, but not of the scale of Amichai. Um, and anyway, but he was friendly with Amichai, and one day he told us that next week Yehuda Amichai is going to come to the class, so prepare these poems of his. So Amichai comes to class, and we're reading one of the poems, and one of my classmates says to him, I think when you write, and I don't remember what the poem was. I don't remember what the line was. I don't remember what the interpretation was, because that's not really what's important. So my classmate gives his interpretation of the meaning of something Amichai wrote, and then he says, "Is that right?" And Amichai says, "It's not important. All right, it's not important what I think. Once the poem is published, it belongs to you as much as it belongs to me, right? And if you see it there, it's there. Whether I intended to put it there or not is irrelevant. If that's what it means to you, that's as legitimate and understanding as any other." And that's really stood with me, because one of the things that that we encounter, like when we look at Rashi, right, or some other commentators, we say, how the heck did he get that, right? I mean, and it's clear. I mean, to me at least, it's clearly not what the author of the text intended the text to mean. All right, whether you want to consider that the author of the text is an author with a capital A or a small a, right? The author had an intention, and the reader is not always reading the text in accordance with the original intention of the author. And I have to say, this is one of the reasons why my Bible studies in graduate school were so unsatisfactory, because there's a certain German scholarly paradigm that says that each text has one and only one original meaning, and that the task of scholarship is to figure out what that original meaning is. Okay, and that, to me, that's an interesting intellectual exercise, but it's not Torah, right? Torah is what the text has meant to Am Yisrael over the ages. In other words, we talk about Torah min hashamayim, but Torah is really found in the encounter between the divine text and a human community, right? And it's the community that determines the meaning of the text, okay? And Amichai, who was not, he would not have considered himself dati. I mean, one of the great tragedies of Israel, although it's, I think, less and less so, but people are either dati or chiloni, right? And you sort of have to pick a side. And if Amichai had to pick a side, he would have picked the chiloni team. But he, his poetry is shot through with references to, not only the Bible. I mean, all Israeli poets refer to the Bible, but he knew the whole corpus of rabbinic literature. And, I mean, anyway, this is not a class on Amichai, so I don't want to get carried away. But that statement of Amichai made me much more comfortable with the idea that the meaning of the text is determined by the reading community, and that it is, once you write a text and send it out there, it belongs to everybody and not just to the author anymore. Okay, I think we'll see that very clearly in the Rashi material that we're going to read. But I'll stop for a moment if there are any questions or comments on my preface to the class. Anyway, okay, so we'll go on. All right, so now, this week is a double parsha. It's Tazria-Metzora, and the beginning of Tazria deals with the ritual impurity that a woman contracts by giving birth. But that's a fairly short topic, and then we plunge right into the topic of tzarat. Okay, Metzora means a person who has tzarat, but the section that we're reading from is not actually from Metzora. We're still in Tazria, but most of the bulk of both parshiot deals with this issue of tzarat. Okay, and tzarat is often generally translated as leprosy, right? But there is a tendency now to leave the term untranslated, which I think makes sense, because whatever tzarat is, it's not leprosy, okay? Because tzarat appears not only in the skin of a person, but also in houses and in cloth. And obviously, now you could say that houses and cloth get mold, which they certainly do, right? But human beings don't get mold, right? And so it's not, unless the Bible is conflating two phenomena into one term. But, it's generally accepted that it's not the term leprosy. It's not the disease leprosy, which is also known as Hansen's disease. So, Gail, I don't know if your husband gets royalties when people catch this disease or not. But it's not that. Okay, so if so, why do we tend to, or why do most translations until very recently use the term leprosy for tzarat? Because that's what the term that was used in the Septuagint. Okay, the Septuagint being the Greek translation of the Bible that was made in Alexandria, that became the Bible of the early Christian church. And one of the things that you find, for example, if you're looking at the New Testament, and they quote a verse from the Hebrew scriptures, but it seems to be misquoted, like, behold, a virgin shall conceive and give birth, right? Which is not what the biblical text actually says. It does not say betula, it says alma, which means a young woman. But generally, when the New Testament quotes a text that seems to be incorrect quoted according to us. If you go to the Septuagint, that's the way it appears in the Septuagint. Okay, so that's where, so that in the Septuagint, the Hebrew word alma is translated as parthenos, which does mean virgin. But anyway, so the Septuagint translates sarat as leprosy. Now, I've always sort of kicked around the idea. I mean, if you take the word sarat but you pronounce it with an Ashkenazi pronunciation, it's saras, which to me sounds like psoriasis, right? Psoriasis, but there's no connection between saras and psoriasis. I actually looked this up because psoriasis comes from two Greek words that mean itchy condition. So it's not from so psoriasis doesn't come from psoras. But one of the things that becomes clear is that Rashi and the bulk of the tradition, both before and since, is not talking about leprosy as a physical disease, right? The classic rabbinic understanding of tzara'at is, and some of you know this and some of you don't, but so just to get everybody on the same page, if you take the word Metzora, which is the second part, parasha, Metzora means a person with tzara'at, a leper. But the tradition breaks down the word Metzora into two words, motzi ra, puts out evil, and then the term is motzi shem ra, puts out an evil name, meaning somebody who slanders, so that sara'at is seen as a punishment for slander. Okay, it's not a disease that's caused by, germs or whatever. It is a punishment for slander. And there is some biblical basis for it. The story of Miriam, right? The story of Miriam criticizing Moses concerning his wife. And the text is very unclear exactly what his criticism was, but she criticizes Moses, and then she is struck partially with tzara'at. Her hand becomes white like a leper, right? And then Moses says the shortest prayer in the Torah, Elna Rafanallah, and she, right, oh God, please heal her, and she gets better, right? So if you read that, Miriam was punished for slandering Moses by tzara'at, there is some biblical basis to it, I guess. I don't know. It's not just sort of, a fanciful reading, but you have to understand that basic point, or else the Rashi is going to be completely impenetrable to you. Okay, now, I felt free to give a long introduction because we don't have a lot of material. So, chapter 13, verse 44, Ish Tsarua Hu, he is a man with Sara'at. Tameh Hu, he is unclean, impure. I mean, again, a lot of these words, like, again, tameh is usually translated as unclean, but it's actually a bad translation, right? Because if you hear unclean, right, what do you think? You think dirt, right? And what's the opposite of unclean? Clean, right? But the opposite of tameh is not naki, right? It's not naki, which means clean. It's tahor, which means pure, right? So tameh means like impure, okay? Has somebody who's contracted ritual impurity. Okay, so he's ritually impure. Tamei yitmenu hakohen berosho nigo. The Kohen shall, I mean, literally make him unclean, but it means to declare him unclean in his lesion, his injury, his infection is on his head. Okay. So now, Ainli ela nitakin min ayin l'rabot shar ha-nogim, or ha-negaim, I guess. I know only that these laws apply to those stricken with the lesions on the head. How do I know it includes other people? Because the scripture says, Tamei yitmenu, therefore it includes them all. Again, this is complicated stuff, but most of you have been studying this stuff long enough, right? That you recognize that formulation, Tamei yitmenu, right? Like mot yumat, he shall surely be killed, right? Sakol yisakel, he shall surely be stoned. Not, but right. It serves to intensify, right? So tamei yitmenu means he shall surely pronounce him unclean, but because it's double, right? Right, because tamei yitmenu, so the word tamei appears twice. Okay, so Rashi is reading it in a very different way, and he says, it applies twice. It means not only the thing that the verse is referring to, but it refers to everything. It's understood expansively rather than narrowly. Okay. Questions or comments on that? Is that understood? Did I explain that okay? Everybody was able to understand what I'm saying Rashi says? Okay. Concerning them all, this is the next verse, his garment shall be torn. Okay. So in other words, all of these laws apply to a person with sara'at anywhere on their body, not just on their head, even though the verse refers to sara'at on the head. But that's in the context of understanding. If you look at the whole verse, right? If you look at the whole verse or the whole paragraph, okay, so let me just read quickly the English. If a man loses the hair of his head and becomes bald, he is pure. If he loses the hair on the front of part of his head and becomes bald at the forehead, he is pure. But if a white affection streaked with red appears on the bald part in the front or at the back of the head, it is a scaly eruption that is spreading over the bald part in the front or at the back of the head. The priest shall examine him. If the swollen affection on the bald part in the front or at the back of his head is white, streaked with red, like the leprosy of body, skin, and appearance, the man is leprous, he is impure. The priest shall pronounce him impure, he has the affection on his head. Okay, so in other words, the paragraph is trying to explain how do you determine the difference between baldness and leprosy, right? Because why? Because if you have leprosy, the leprous part is going to lose its hair, right? So baldness is an effect of leprosy, but it doesn't mean that every case of baldness is a case of leprosy, right? So that's the context in which Rashi is explaining the verse. But then, it goes on and it talks about things that apply to everybody who has that has sarat, and not just the person who has sarat on his head. Okay, let's go on. The person with sarat in whom there is the lesion, his garment shall be torn, his head shall be unshorn. He shall cover himself down to his mustache and call out, unclean, unclean. Tameh, tameh, yikare. Okay, so basically, I mean, the word frumim, right? His clothes are in the plural, so that's why the word frumim is in the plural. It's not the plural of frum people, but frumim is an unusual word, so you might not know what it means, but you know what the word karua, torn, like, we cut kriya when somebody dies, right? It's the same word. So Rashi is just here translating the word frum as torn and parua as long hair, and he shall cover himself down to his mustache like a mourner, right? Because there it is kind of a form, you'll see it's kind of a form of mourning. All right. And so safam, which I don't know why people might not know that word, but again, Rashi explains that it is the hair on the lips, say hasvatayim, grenon belaz, grenon in Old French. I don't speak French, neither Old French nor New French. But Gail, you speak French, right?
Didn't know that word.
Okay, but it might not be the word in modern French. I have no idea. Do you know how to say mustache? And does anybody know how to say mustache in French? Okay. All right, and he shall call it unclean, unclean. He announces that he is unclean, so that everyone should stay away from him, right? And all of this, I mean, if we back away from what I'll call the midrashic interpretation for a minute and go instead to the germ theory of disease, right? This whole idea that the person who has tzara'at is contagious, right? And has to leave the camp and dwell apart from other people, and also, warn people, unclean, unclean. I mean, given the fact that we're living in a pandemic, is really, really interesting, right? And it happens that a cousin of mine, so he is actually a second cousin once removed, was hospitalized, and a young man, like around 30, was hospitalized recently for COVID. I mean, he's out and he's okay now, but he was actually at a Pesach Seder, okay? Now I remember. So at a Pesach Seder, it was a small Pesach Seder, and one of the other people there had tested positive for COVID and didn't bother to tell anybody else. Right? Which, to my mind, should literally be a criminal offense. Right? I mean, if you know that you have tested positive and you don't isolate and other people get sick, you should, as far as I'm concerned, you should literally go to jail. But this idea that we have an obligation when we are afflicted with a contagious illness to not only isolate but also warn other people. I mean, this is straight out of the Torah. I mean, we knew this 3,500 years ago, right? And the fact that there are some people in America, and here I'll be a little ethnocentric and say that, there are places in the country where I expect that. From Jews in Westchester, New York, I frankly don't expect this, but they say in the Torah Zemayesh, right? It is what it is. But it's pretty profound reading this in the context of the pandemic through which we're living. I've been speaking an awful long time. Does anybody have any questions or comments on anything so far? Okay, we'll go on. All the days, so verse 46, all the days the lesion is upon him, he shall remain unclean. He is unclean. He shall dwell isolated. Hu badad yeshev, he shall dwell by himself. Michutz lamachane moshavo. All right, his dwelling place shall be michutz lamachane, outside the camp. And michutz lamachane, I mean, this is like totally modern Hebrew. I mean, it's obviously biblical Hebrew, but it is used frequently in modern Hebrew as well. I mean, anybody who speaks modern Hebrew will recognize the phrase michutz lamachane. You're outside the camp, meaning, you're what? You're not one of us, right? You're not one of us. You're michutz lamachane, right? You support things that we don't support. Da 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 da. You've placed yourself michutz lamachane, outside the camp. Okay, but now Rashi gets midrashic here. All right, meaning that. All right, he shall dwell isolated, badad yeshev, okay, that he shall dwell by himself, okay? What does that mean? Shelo yihiu sha'at me'imim yoshvim imo, that the other unclean people shall not dwell with him. Okay, now, so this is actually a difference, I guess, from the isolation that's demanded of COVID, right? I mean, if you have tested positive, right, you can be in isolation. I mean, you're actually supposed to be in isolation with the other people with whom you live, right? Because they are potentially afflicted as well. But there's no, I'm not aware of any sort of medical reason that a person who is COVID positive can't isolate together with those other COVID positive people. But if you are a Metzora, then that's a different situation. Why? Amru Rabotenu ma nishtana mishar tmeim leishev badad. Why is he different from other unclean people? That he must remain isolated. All right. In other words, there are other. I mean, sarat is not the only form of impurity. There's all kinds of other impurities, and if you have these other types of impurity, you may have to isolate from people who are not impure, but you don't have to isolate from other impure people, right? You don't have to be totally isolated. But here, if you have tzara'at, you have to be totally isolated. Why? Since with his slander he caused a separation between man and wife, or between man and his fellow, he too shall be separated from society. The rationale is based on the premise that a person is stricken with tzara'at as a result of his talking lashon hara, speaking derogatorily of others, although he may be telling the truth. Okay, so that right? So the point is, if we understand this isolation as a punishment for slander, or lashon hara, evil speech, right? You can't, right? The only cure for evil speech is total isolation. You cannot let this person infect other people, right? And, I don't know, comes to mind the punishment of shutting down your Facebook and your Twitter accounts, right? By the way, my Facebook account was shut down for a day, and I couldn't figure out why. And then they let me back in, and I realized that I had set up a Facebook page for my dog as a public figure, and when Facebook finally let me back in, that page was taken down. They didn't explain to me that, but it has to be. So Rashi the Westie, creating a page, Rashi the Westie, got me in trouble with Facebook, but I was only in Facebook jail for a day, and then they gave me back my account, right? But there is a sense that a certain type of speech is so harmful that it has to be cut out entirely, right? Now, on a First Amendment level, this is a problem. Having said that, I mean, free speech does not require other people to provide you a forum for that speech, right? So Twitter is private, Facebook is private, Instagram, YouTube, they're all private. As far as I'm concerned, they have a legal right and sometimes a moral obligation to simply shut down certain types of speech, because they're not the government. I don't believe in the government shutting down speech except in the rarest of instances. But we see how dangerous speech can be, and that, even limiting a person to speaking to other people like him or other people who already buy into what he's saying, how dangerous that can be, right? As witness January 6th. All right, so any questions or comments on any of this so far?
Rabbi Arian, I do have a general comment.
Sure.
The basic sense of all of this is that without separation, there is no way to develop any kind of a pathway toward healing. Separation is the key noun that connects all of this. And of course, I'm thinking in terms of our dealing with COVID over the last year, that one of the heartbreaks of separation was in nursing homes,
Sure.
where those in the home for a long time could see no one, no relatives. At best, they could stand outside the window and knock, because the folks in the nursing home were very concerned, if not frightened, about the spread amongst those that were in the nursing home and didn't want folks bringing more in or having more come out. So the bottom line here, isn't it ultimately that the Torah is saying, if you have disease, from what we understand at this point, if you do not become separated, you become liable to yourself and everyone else.
Sure. But yes, absolutely. But, so here is a case where the rabbinic tradition reads the text clearly in a non-literal way. Right now again, I don't know what Rashi had in mind. Okay, I don't know whether Rashi really thinks that Sarat is imposed in some sort of divine magical way on people as a punishment for Lashon Hara, or whether he's just trying to make the text meaningful and relevant in a wildly different context. Okay, because it's also worth noting that, you know, certainly by the time of Rashi, but well before that, I mean, people understood that Sara'at as a disease cannot be simply one phenomenon, because there's no disease that affects people, houses, and cloth, right? They understood that, right? So already, you know, in the early rabbinic period, they said, by the way, Sara'at only occurs in the land of Israel and only when the temple is standing. Okay. Now, what kind of disease? I mean, I guess there are diseases that occur only in some places and not others, but only when the temple is. Now, it's a good thing that it occurs only when the temple is standing, right? Because one of the things that you have to do at the when you are no longer afflicted with Sarat, and you know, so the Kohen has found you to be clean. All right, we'll use the word clean, and therefore you're ready to go back into society. One of the things that you have to do is bring a sacrifice, right? No temple, no sacrifice. No sacrifice, can't go back in society, right? So in a way, it's a very humane thing to say that, you know, Tzara'at only applies in Israel and only when the temple is standing, because otherwise, if people got leprosy, real leprosy, even if they got better, they couldn't reintegrate into society, right? Because they can't bring a sacrifice, right? I mean, there, you know, I mean, there are certain rituals that like are that's like a sine qua non, right? Like if you can't do the ritual, then you can't have the benefits of having done the ritual, right? So if you have Sara'at and you recover, but you don't bring the sacrifice, you don't get to reintegrate into society, right? So by saying, well, this only applied in temple times, nobody was caught in that sort of leap. All right. All right. Anything out? So the next part, outside the camp, outside the three camps of Israel, namely the camp of the Shekhinah, the Levite camp, and the camp of the Israelites. So this is talking about, because remember, this was originally, you know, in the Torah in Sinai, right? So it's talking about the different camps, and that's why it says outside the camp, because when these laws were originally given, the Israelites literally did live in a camp, right? And the camp moved. So it means, it doesn't mean so there's three sort of concentric circles, right? There's the camp Machaneh Shechina, which is where the tabernacle is, right? And then Machaneh Levi, which is where the Levites and the Kohanim are included in the Levites live, and then Machaneh Yisrael, the camp of everybody else. And this person, so lest you say, well, obviously he can't dwell in the camp of the temple or the camp of the Levites, but he could still dwell with everybody. No, he has to be outside the camp entirely. Okay. All right. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, this shall be the law of the person afflicted with Sarat. On the day of his cleansing, he shall be brought to the Kohen. This is actually the beginning of Parshat Metzora, the second of our two parshiot. All right. Zot tehiyeh tarat ha-metzora milamed she'ein metaharin oto b'layla. This shall be the law of the person afflicted with sarat. This teaches us that one afflicted with sarat is not pronounced clean at night. Okay, now, unless you are fairly deeply into rabbinic texts, that Rashi has to still be impenetrable. All right, does anybody, I mean, not what it means, right? It means that a person with sarat is only proclaimed clean during the day, not at night. But how does that follow out of that text?
No.
Does anybody know?
It says
I
on the
figured
day,
Barnaby might. I'll ask you to hold off and let's see if anybody else gets it.
Okay.
well, it says on the day of his cleansing, how, if it's at night, how can he see?
Right. I mean, you're not to use the same metaphor, but you're groping your way towards the answer. Right? It says Bayom Tahorato, Yom Velo Lila, but I think there's something else as well. Barnaby?
Well, normal tuma is, the process of getting rid of it is you go in the mikvah, the hospital of the mayim, you dip your flesh in the water, and he is impure until the night.
Right. He's in Tamehu ad ha'aretz. He's impure on the night until the night. But I think there's something else going on here. Okay? And it has to do with the word zot. Okay? Remember back when we used to have services in the shul, right? And we'd have Hagbah,
Yeah.
right? Say V'zot HaTorah, right? And what do? You point,
Yes.
right? And in the 10th chapter of Bavli Psachim, the Talmud, there is a debate over whether a blind person can lead the Seder, right? And the Gemara actually rules that a blind person can't lead the Seder, but then they bring stories about blind people who did, right? But why in the world would it occur to anybody that a blind person can't lead the Seder? Right? Because matzah zu, right? Zu zot, sha'anu ochlim, right? This matzah, we have the words, right? What do you have? You have to point to it, right? And if you're blind, how do you know where to point? Right? So that anytime, right, zeh or zot, right? I mean, and this is like, for example, in the law of the stubborn and rebellious son, right, which the rabbis have totally eliminated, right? But it says that the parents have to bring the son to the judges and say, B'neinu zeh, this our son, he doesn't listen to us, he's a glutton and a drunkard, all right? And the zeh means that they have to point to him, okay? Which means if one of the parents is blind, the law can't be carried out because you can't point, right? So I think I could be wrong, right? Because I haven't. I mean, there are actually super commentaries, right? There are commentaries that tell you what Rashi means, but I think it has to do also with the word zot, okay? That zot implies daytime, right? Because it implies pointing, and that can't be done at night because it's dark and you don't know where to point, right? I could be completely wrong, but I'm
Interesting.
I'm actually convinced that this is part of it as well. All right. right? Because Rashi doesn't actually bring the whole phrase, but that doesn't matter. I mean, when he quotes only part of a phrase, he implies the whole phrase. Okay. All right, I'm gonna skip a little bit. If look at chapter 4, the Kohen shall order. Verse 4. The person to be cleansed shall take 2 live clean birds, a cedar stick, a strip of crimson wool, and hyssop. Okay, live birds, meaning it's exclude birds that have a fatal disease or injury. Prat means excluding, prat letrefot. Okay. Trefot obviously is a word that you all recognize, right? Trefa. But the original meaning of trefa it means torn, but in terms of kashrut, a trefa is an animal that will die soon of natural causes. Okay, for cattle, it means an animal that will die of natural causes within the next year, that it has an injury that would cause it to die within a year. Okay, but I imagine I actually don't know. I have no real expertise in this, but I am right, because I don't slaughter, nor do I check in a slaughterhouse. But I have to imagine for birds, it's less than a year, because the lifespan of birds is not that long, right? But the bird has to be alive, but not only alive. In other words, a trefa is considered like sort of dead. But you can't say, well, it's a waste for me to bring, a good healthy bird that I otherwise would, eat for my Shabbos dinner. So I'll just bring the sick one. No, it has to be, in good health. Okay. And they have to be clean birds, not unclean, meaning kosher birds, not unclean. Why are birds? Because sarad comes as a result of derogatory speech, which is done by chattering. Therefore, for his cleansing, this person is required to bring birds which twitter constantly with chirping sounds. Okay, so it's a kind of measure for measure.
Yeah.
Right? You caused right, because birds, right? You've gone around, so right. So there's a sort of, dare I say, vicarious atonement.
Mhm.
Right? There is a vicarious atonement that you are forgiven and can come back into society. But these birds that go, they have to give up their lives. And by them giving up their lives, you are made clean. Right? Where have we heard that before? Right? It's not, right? There is, even Christian ideas which to Jews are heretical or incomprehensible often still have their roots somewhere in rabbinic Judaism, right? The idea of vicarious atonement is not crazy. It's not at all crazy, right? And if you know of the ritual of Shlug and Kapporis, right, between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, right? You know what Shlug and Kapporis is, right? Where you transfer your sins to a bird, right? If you're male, it's a rooster. If you're female, it's a hen. And you transfer your sins to the bird, and you swing it over your head, and then the bird is shechted, and optimally it's shechted in a kosher manner and given to the poor. although, I am told that actually it's fairly routine to find in places like Borough Park or Kiryas Yoel piles of rotting chicken carcasses. But that idea of vicarious atonement is not, like I say, it's not unknown. Okay, and a cedar stick, because the haughtiness symbolized by the tall cedar, and crimson and hyssop, he must humble himself from his haughtiness. And here, so crimson is tola'at shani, right? Which literally means tolat is a worm, right? And right there, crimson, apparently the biblical color crimson comes from a worm. It's a dye produced from a worm. Maybe it's no silk. Silk is white when it comes out of the silkworm, right? But so crimson, even though it's a royal color, can symbolize humility too, because it comes from a worm. And so the ritual has symbolism also of not only vicarious atonement, but also humbling himself. And then the person being cleansed shall then immerse his garments, shave off all his hair, and immerse in water, and become clean. After this, he may enter the camp, but he shall remain outside his tent for 7 days, right? Ahar yavo el hamachne, he can come to the camp, v'yeshev michutz la'ohalo, but he shall dwell outside his tent, shivat yamim, 7 days, right? Milam, this teaches us that during this period he is prohibited to have marital relations, right? But it's a gradual re-entering of society, right? And I mean, this thought just came to me now, which is also something that I think is relevant to our current situation. I mean, in a couple of ways, right? One is that people who are now considered fully vaccinated, most of us are not just sort of, okay, we're done with this, right? Right? I have been in the week and a half since I'm considered fully vaccinated. I've been into 2 stores, right? I've been into my office a couple of times, right? I mean, I don't know anybody who just said, oh, well, I'm now done with this. I'm going to go back to living my life exactly the way I did pre-pandemic. But also one of the things that we've learned and we're grappling with is it's not an on-off switch, right? I mean, again, when at the point that we're ready to have services in the shul, right? It's not going to be, oh, this is all done, right? We'll all come back and do exactly the way we did, and we'll all sit on top of each other on little tables, not on little tables, but around little tables, and eat tuna fish and bagels, right? And we won't have 5 people standing shoulder to shoulder at the bima for the Torah reading and so on and so forth, right? It's going to be a gradual sort of re-entry. It's not an on-off switch. And apparently coming back from Sarat is not an on-off switch either. There's a gradual process of re-entry into society. Okay, Ad Khan. Any questions or comments on anything that we've gone over tonight?
Just,
Barnaby.
you mentioned earlier that a Metzora is prohibited from participating in all the temple rituals that require Tahora, as presumably as some sort of punishment, which, I'm brought, what comes to mind for me is, so let me back up a little bit. Are we under the assumption that because that man contracted Tzara or was declared Tameh, it was not like a normal kind of tuma, which just necessitates a mikvah or something like that, like Tameh mate, that any ritual obligations that he might normally not be able to accomplish is he putter? Is he exempt from doing those because of his tzarat?
I don't know. I mean, I would have to say that to a certain extent, your question is anachronistic.
Okay.
Right. In the sense that I that idea of patur, exempt. I mean,
it's all theoretical, of course.
Right. It's all theoretical, but it's also, I mean, and I don't know enough, frankly, to answer that question. Right. I mean, I would say that, there's certainly the concept of, which we've discussed a lot in the last 13 months of anus rachmana patre, right? That force majeure, right, brings with it exemption, right? And if you look at that phrase literally, anus rachmana patre, if somebody is forced or coerced, Rachmana, the merciful one, has exempted, the merciful one being God, right? So, if it's a great question that applies more in a different context that I'll mention in a second, right? I mean, but if you are assuming on the biblical level, meaning the original meaning of the text, that you were really talking about a physical disease that was highly contagious, right? They knew enough to say you have to be michutz lamachane. If you have to be michutz lamachane, you can't come to the temple, right? It endangers everybody else, right? So you would have to be exempt, right? Now, I mean, it's an interesting question in light of, but if you read it the way Rashi reads it, which is that it's sort of a moral flaw, right? And you are being excluded from the community because of a moral flaw, right? It raises the issue. I mean, God help me, but I read I don't read it all the time, but I look at America Magazine. Okay, America Magazine, which is published by the Jesuits of the United States, right? And they recently had 2 articles about the question of excluding people in same-sex marriages from communion, right? Where the Jesuits say, of course not. And then some bishop says, oh my God, we must exclude these people from the sacrament. In fact, we're not excluding them. They're excluding themselves by their, flouting the clear, right? And now it's interesting, right? Because a priest is a priest, right? And the Catholic understanding of the priesthood is that it is a direct continuation of the kahuna, right? And that their altar is called an altar because it is the direct lineal connection to the mizbeach, right? And that's why the mass is called a sacrifice, right? So in that sense, I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question, right? It's an interesting question, whereas we would say, most of us would say, right, that access to the shul or the church is not a sanctuary for the pure. It's a hospital for the sick, right? I mean, you know, if we're going to limit access to our rituals to only people who are blameless, it's going to be a very small congregation.
I mean, to put it more in more direct terms, hopefully less opaque, would a Metzora, if he contracted Tzaras before Pesach, would he have to do a Pesach Sheni in the same way that a regular Tamei Mat would? Because Pesach Sheni is what we envision as a second chance, so to speak.
Right.
And in this theoretical context, I was saying, because you did the bad things, Motzi Shem Ra, that made you do Tzara, you nullify, you completely bottled your second chance to do Pesach.
I have no idea. It's a great question. It's a great question. I will try and find the answer. I mean, I'm sure there's an answer, right? The question is simply, right, if somebody was a Metzora during Pesach, right, but they're tahor before Pesach Sheni, do they bring the Korban Pesach for Pesach Sheni, right? I mean, there has to be an answer. There has to be an answer.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what it is, but there has to be one. I mean, I'm sure that somewhere in the codes that question has been addressed, and I'll try and see if I can find the answer.
Okay. Thanks.
Great. Okay. Anyone else? All right. Thank you very much, Lila Tov.
Thank you.
Lila Tov, thank you.
See you on Shabbos.
Yeah.
Mm.
Thank you, Lila Tov.